you know, over the weekend, I flew to Michigan to visit my niece who was in the hospital. She passed away on Sunday. You know, which is kind of tough, and hang out with my brother and his family to whatever extent I could, you know, be any comfort. One of my kids went along with me, and sitting in the plane, I noticed, and you know, being a pilot, I have been a pilot since '72. I noticed these things. The cockpit door was completely hardened. I mean, it was covered with stainless steel. It had a little keypad next to it to get into it. There's no way you could kick in that door. And it used to be you could easily kick in airplane doors. And in fact, it used to be so easy to kick in airplane doors that, you know, we had hundreds and hundreds of hijackings. This is, you know, before 9/11. In 1968, December of 1968, as the holiday travel season was kicking off, Time magazine ran an article titled, "What to Do When the Hijacker Comes," because there had been more than 130 airplane hijackings between 1968 and 72. On some occasions, there was more than one a day. Now, they largely petered out in the 70s, but people continued to attack pilots and co-pilots. In 2000, for example, there was a guy who was trying to get to the Southwest Airlines plane's controls, and the passengers took him down and put him in a chokehold, and he suffocated to death. A few months later, on a British Airways 747, a passenger breached the cockpit door, severely bit the captain's ear, disengaged the autopilot, and threw the plane into a 10,000-foot dive before the co-pilot could regain control. As a result of all of this has been going on for 20 years. As a result of all this, the airline pilots, their unions, and even passenger groups were begging the airlines to harden their cockpit doors. But the airlines didn't want to do this. I mean, you know, they've got thousands of airplanes, and it's $100,000, a couple $100,000 a plane to harden the doors. They didn't want to spend the money. So in 1996, Al Gore convened the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, and, you know, one of their initial suggestions was, let's harden cockpit doors. And immediately, the airline industry came in. It started with TWA, literally the day after. Well, the day after the report was leaked, Al Gore wrote a groveling letter to Carol Hallett, who was the head of the lobbying group for the airlines. It's called the Air Transport Association, saying, I want to make it very clear that it is not the intent of this administration or the commission to create a hardship for the air transportation industry. And in fact, they stripped out of their final report any recommendation that airplane doors be hardened. You know, the doors into the cockpit doors be hardened. And the day after Al Gore wrote that letter, TWA gave $40,000 to the DNC. That's $100,000 in today's money. Over the next month, the Northwest Airlines, United Airlines, Delta Airlines, and American Airlines all threw in together what was over $1 million in today's money into the DNC and into the Clinton campaign. And you know, all of this was completely legal. I'm not, you know, saying this to trash talk Bill Clinton or Al Gore. Everybody was doing it. Why? Because the Supreme Court legalized this in 1978. In 1978, in a decision written by Lewis Powell himself, the U.S. Supreme Court said that corporations are people, and therefore they have rights under the Bill of Rights, under the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And amendment number 1, the First Amendment, is you have the right to free speech. And corporations as persons have the right to free speech, and that right to free speech includes the right to buy and bribe politicians, because money is just the same thing as speech. Didn't you know that? And then in my article, I get into all the harms that this has caused to the United States. I mean, you know, it has allowed, because billionaire ideologues and corporations have paid off politicians, mostly Republicans, but some Democratic shills like the so-called problem solvers. They've gutted our public schools. They've privatized public electric and water utilities. They've ended government subsidies for colleges or cut them. They've kept the taxes so low that most billionaires only pay 3%. They've raised the Social Security retirement age to 67. Notice in France, people are in the streets because they want to raise it from 62 to 64. But Reagan raised it to 67. It took effect a couple of years ago. They're selling off public lands for pennies on the dollar to mining and drilling companies. They fought efforts to force chemical and fossil fuel companies to clean up their toxic dumps. They allowed banks, airlines, and hospitals to nickel and dime us to death. They shipped our factories overseas and our jobs. They defunded the IRS so it couldn't audit billionaires. They made it harder for low-income workers, people on Social Security, and students to vote. They purged tens of millions of Democratic voters from the voting rolls just before elections, which is how Jeb Bush handed Florida to his brother. He purged 20,000 African Americans 3 months before the election, and George won by 537 votes. They're gerrymandering states. They're tolerating monopolies. None of these things are things that the majority of Americans want. All of these things are things that corporate America or right-wing billionaires paid politicians to do. Now, there are some things we can do about this. We can, the Supreme Court can use Article 3, Section 2, the Congress can use that and shut down the Supreme Court's ability to rule on money in politics. We can amend the Constitution. We can institute a judicial code of ethics. We can put cameras in the courtroom. I mean, and we can expand the size of the court. Those are the main 5 things we can do.